Okay, well, I'm going to follow the lead ahead of me. Howdy. When you get a couple Aggies in the room, that's what happens. So thank you all for being here. My name is Wendy Shabay with Freese and Nichols, and I'm a planner, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today from a planning perspective of how we tie many of the things that you've heard today together. So first of all, let me tell you just a little bit about who we are. Freese and Nichols is the oldest engineering company in Texas. We were founded in 1894. We built the first water treatment plant in Fort Worth. And there are very few lakes, rivers, pipelines, or cities in the state of Texas that we haven't touched in some form or fashion. What we do is we primarily work for cities, counties, municipalities, and water districts in both planning and designing facilities. We've got offices all over Texas, but then also outside of Texas as well. So I come to you from a national perspective, but on a very regional scale. Born and raised in Fort Worth, but I also represent the American Planning Association, APA, 40,000 planners that are represented from across the industry within cities that do most of the planning. And so being on that board and being leader at Freese and Nichols, I come again from a planner's perspective on long range of how we do these things. So we talked a little bit about El Paso and some of the things that they were doing, and they're doing some great programs, but I want you to kind of raise your head, if you will. If you zoom out on your Google Maps, or you think about getting on the plane and you get to that 30,000 foot view elevation where they tell you can take your seatbelts off, that's where we are right now. I want you to kind of think of things from that 30,000 foot view, because that's the lens of which we look through when we are doing planning, a much more high-level approach. So one of the things that APA has put out is the Sustaining Places in helping cities grow and helping cities plan for their future, and looking at all of these different and great things that we are doing in our environment, how that all fits together, and how we meet the growth of the profession and our future growth. And so I look at things from a comprehensive planning perspective. It's much of what we do. So we ask the question of how are we going to implement these things, and how are we going to build for our future, and how are we going to be able to look at things from a lens where we are conserving, we are sustaining our places, and we are building things that are thoughtful for the future. And a lot of the ways that we do that is from comprehensive planning. And again, I'm approaching this from a city standpoint because all of us live somewhere. All of us probably, if you live in Texas, and especially if you live in the DFW area, you've seen the growth. You've probably feel the growth that we are having all the time. And so we look at the comprehensive plan as being a key thing that is looking at how are we going to look at land use? How are we going to best look at our transportation networks? How are we looking at infrastructure? What are we going to do to be able to accommodate that growth and to do it in a healthy way that is going to make good decisions for the future? And so that's very much what we're looking at when we're looking at a comprehensive plan for a city. We're looking at all of those specific elements. We're also looking at it from the standpoint of special areas and downtowns, and you think of the things that make a place special, be it a very, very urban environment of a downtown, or be it the great nature of the Trinity River. All those things that make a place special, that make you want to be that, those are the things that we look at as a part of that. And so it's looking at sustainability and all these other key components. From our standpoint, a comprehensive plan is a blueprint. When you think about it, if you're going to go build a house, you have a blueprint. It's going to tell you what to build and how you want to do that. And that's really what a comprehensive plan is for a city. It's telling it how to build. And particularly if disaster strikes, which unfortunately we see more of that, be it tornadoes or floods or whatever, when that happens, how are we going to rebuild our cities? How are we going to rebuild our communities? And that's what planning does so well, is it's looking at all of those different things. It's also looking at the different modes of transportation that we use. I loved Steve's comment on kayaking. I don't have that one on my mode of transportation, but I guess I need to. When we're looking at bikes and pedestrians and all the different mobility ways of getting more people around and out of their cars and in different ways, those are definitely the things that are best practices in our planning world that we ought to be looking at. Certainly, we're looking at things from a resiliency standpoint, and again, from a disaster, from a hazard mitigation perspective, how are we going to rebuild? How are we going to weather the storms of whether it be severe flooding or severe droughts? Those are things that, as planners, are incredibly important to us to look at as we are looking at building the future of our communities. Also, just looking at the health, and I was glad Jay brought this up from a health standpoint. A couple of years ago, APA was granted a grant from CDC, from the Center of Disease Control. And I know some of our planners were thinking, why is planners getting a grant from the Center of Disease Control? What was so interesting and healthy in that whole dialogue was they gave us the grant for that because they realized that as planners, we have a really big role in the health of our communities. That when we're looking at things from trails and connectivity and the walkability and the parks and all of those things that mentioned earlier about getting us outside the walls of our homes and our businesses to take advantage of how we promote healthy communities, how we look at food deserts and things like that, and making sure that those land uses match up. That's how we correlate. And so that's become a really big best practice when we're looking at planning, is also looking at that health component of what we do. Additionally, just looking at the economics. I know this may think, why does this have to do with conservation? But you know, if every one of you, Christmas is coming up, you're going to be on the web, right? You're going to be looking at probably something when you're looking at gifts. Our whole retail culture has shifted dramatically, and it's, much more looking at, things online. And so that's going to affect the stores. It's going to affect the routes. We've got less people being on the road, but we got more delivery drivers and Uber drivers and things like that on the road. So all of those shifts, we are in a huge technology shift right now that impacts our built environment, and those are some of the things that we look at. So from our standpoint, why do plans not always work? Well, number one, sometimes there's not real clear implementation. And we have become much more implementation focused on how do we not just set a plan that's 30 years in the future, but what are the steps of which we need to do that? And also partnerships. And I got to tell you, I'm really impressed at this conference and just listening to some of the things that are going on and everyone's doing, because oftentimes we're asking, how do we partner with one another? Who are those groups that we can come in and help partner in long-range planning and in the implementation of projects to be able to make sure that we're meeting all those long-term goals. So I think that there is a lot of partnerships that can take place, and that also we just need owners to be able to understand that planning is so important. I tell you, we do a lot of public meetings as a part of our plan, and sometimes we go to public meetings and people don't want change. They don't often want things to be done, and they don't want to spend the money doing it. But the reality is, especially in Texas, we're growing and our environment is changing, and so if we don't plan for that future, then we are going to be looking down the road, and there will be consequences with that. So taking ownership of those plans are very important. So just a few projects I thought I would share with you from an innovative standpoint that we look at. This happens to be Rodney Cook Park. That is Atlanta's new Atlanta Falcons Stadium in the background. We think AT&T is big, but that gives it a run for its money. So this was a big park area. It was actually a mitigation area for some stormwater that became a detention pond, but we made that into a great asset because it was a area, a neighborhood that really needed it, that really needed those environments to be able to get outside of their home. Earlier today, we heard a presentation from Oyster Reefs. This was actually a living shoreline. We were asked to come in and do some improvements for some erosion issues, and ended up creating a living shoreline, and then with that, put these oysters in place to be able to not only create that habitat and help that breakwater, but also on the backside of this marshy area to be able to create a good habitat for juvenile fish and crabs and so on. On a whole different scale, this is the integrated pipeline. This is a new pipeline that will go from East Texas to bring future water to Dallas, in connection with the North Texas Municipal Water District. Massive pipeline. If you see the little bitty guy on the top of that, it's a massive pipeline, but it was the first Envision rated pipeline ever. And all Envision rating is, it's kind of like LEEDs, if you're familiar with that with building. Envision is a sustainability factor for pipelines and other infrastructure type projects, and this was one of the first Envision rated. All the way to roads, and looking at doing roads where we are limiting congestion, where we are creating bioswales and environments along our roadways to make sure that we're taking advantage of those small opportunities. And even with LEED buildings, and again, and everything we're doing, creating that pedestrian environment and looking at multi-modes of transportation, to also working with our partners on all of our streams and lakes and restoration of those, and parks and trails and things like that go along that. This is a park in Austin, and I mentioned, I love what Steve was talking about in the Fort Worth, because that was one of the things, that was actually one of my projects, was the Trinity River Trails and the connection of many of those trails. And so that's always a big component. And also the partnership and getting the community involved and understanding those aspects are so critically important, because we do have a generation out there that doesn't understand how important the environment is, and yet they do understand so much about the conservation and sustainability. And so we've got a great advantage of being able to capture that youth and pull them into those projects, and yet continue to advocate for people in the community. So just a few key takeaways. I think that long-range planning has such an incredible effect on our environment, and being able to making sure that we are continuing to do good long-range plannings throughout all of our cities. Again, I echo that specifically within these fast-growing areas of what we have right now. Also the public health and those natural resources. You heard a little bit about why those are important, but we've learned that so much as we're doing long-range planning. The health of our communities is so incredibly important, and so we are certainly looking at that. That innovative design, whether it be pipeline or a living shoreline or a roadway, that all of those innovative designs, we're certainly looking at that. They need to be looked at, because there's a lot of ways that we can bring innovation, sustainability, conservation measures into the built environment every day, depending on the different projects that we have. And that our strategic approach to growth is very important, that is critically important as we're looking forward. And I think the more we plan for, the better off that we will be in the future.